Hi, everybody. We are moving through a series with our leadership community on how to create a culture of disciple making. And today we're going to be looking at engaging best practices. Now, that is a secular term, best practices, but it really has a biblical category behind it. When you think of best practices, you're really talking about wisdom. Certain questions are answered not on the basis of right and wrong, but on the basis of wise or foolish. Is this wise or is this foolish? If you're trying to gain mastery in any area, you're trying to be wise about it. In other words, how can I be wise about the way I teach my classroom at school, or I operate in the at my medical clinic? We're going to be talking about discipleship, but you're going to see it has a range of application. So let me begin by simply saying this. The difference between knowledge and wisdom is knowledge is knowing that a tomato is not a vegetable, it's a fruit, okay? But wisdom is knowing that you don't put a tomato in a fruit salad. So wisdom is the application of knowledge. And oftentimes it comes over time. You gain it with experience, but that's one of the great things about living in a community like ours, or really any Christian community, is designed so that you have that rich interaction in which you learn from those who have gone before you and can apply wisdom or best practices. Now, educational theorists will tell us this, that the best way to gain mastery in any area, whether it's being a heart surgeon or a chef or whatever you're doing, even being a disciple maker, is the interaction of three different dynamics. First of all is lecture, secondly is apprenticeship, and thirdly is immersion. Let me briefly unpack each of those for you. First of all, lecture excels in the transmission of information, okay? When you sit and take notes as you listen to someone who has some expertise in something, you are experiencing that kind of simulated classroom experience. This e-training is one example of that, and there are obviously many. Oftentimes the problem is that people stop there. They don't go on to the second dynamic, which is apprenticeship. If lecture is the best way of transmitting information, the best way of mastering skills is by attaching yourself to an apprentice, to someone who has done it 100 times, 1,000 times, and you learn from them in the application, in the apprenticeship relationship. So for instance, if I needed heart surgery, I would not want someone who had simply read a good book on heart surgery. I would not want somebody who'd seen a video on it. Those might be helpful, but I want someone who spent some time in the operating room with a master surgeon, and they've had a long period of give and take where, you watch me do it, now I'm going to watch you do it. That's the person I want to operate on me, and that's what apprenticeship is. You see it too in the trades, plumbers, carpenters, so forth. The way they learn best is not by reading books or going to seminars, but by actually going out with an apprentice or a master carpenter, a master plumber, and watching them, observing them, learning from them. Many of you who are ladies probably were apprenticed in cooking by watching your mother or maybe a grandmother. So we transmit information through lecture. We master skills through apprenticeship. And the third dynamic is an immersion. And by immersion, I mean this. How does a child, or let's say a toddler, learn a language? If you adopt a child at a few months and drop them into a Chinese-speaking family, guess what? They're going to speak Chinese. It's kind of a mystery how it all happens, but that's exactly what happens. If you put them in an English-speaking family, they're going to learn to speak English. So if you wanted to learn French, in other words, if you wanted to master the French language, what's the best way to do that? Well, it's not just immersion, it's the interplay of all three. In other words, take 101 through 301 classes in high school, French 101 through 301. Get that transmission of information. But secondly, don't stop just in the classroom, but get an apprentice, hire a tutor in this case, who can help you to kind of customize the instruction for where you're having the most problems and so forth. You need an apprentice, you need a tutor, and then take a semester abroad. Go to France, because when you immerse yourself in the French culture, guess what's going to happen? Everything in your surroundings is going to be in French. The TV is going to be in French. The signage is going to be in French. You're going to hear everybody speaking in French, and over time, your French is going to get much, much better. So it's the interaction of those three that really create mastery over time. Now, let's just think for a second about disciple making. Disciple making is interesting in that the smartest guy who ever lived in the history of the world is Jesus, okay? And if you study closely how Jesus discipled the 12, you will find that he employed all three of those dynamics. So first of all, let's just work our way through it again. You see Jesus transmitting information. The Bible says, don't you know, don't you know, don't you know. In other words, there are certain things you have to know about the Christian life. And so you have to transmit information in a simulated classroom experience, like the Sermon on the Mount, parables of the kingdom, the Olivet Discourse. All of those would be examples, rich examples of Jesus transmitting information through his teaching ministry to his disciples. It's also interesting that the book of Matthew, some of you have seen me do this before, is structured in a very interesting way. I make 5 blocks with a little line in between them, because Matthew has structured that gospel to go like this. This is what Jesus did. This is what he said. This is what Jesus did. This is what he said. And he goes through the 5 blocks of teaching, and you can kind of see that the centrality of Jesus' teaching in that. But it doesn't stop there. Notice what happens. As you go to Matthew chapter 10, Luke chapter 10, you're going to see examples of apprenticeship where Jesus sends them out, 2 by 2, because they've been watching him proclaim the kingdom, heal the sick, cast out demons and so forth. He tasks them with exactly the same thing that he's been doing. And he sends them out in 2s. Why? Because they have a built-in apprenticeship experience. They've already been apprenticed by him. They begin to experience now amongst each other. And in Luke's version, he points out that at the end of the day, they come back together and they have a debrief session with Jesus, okay? Now, that's apprenticeship. It's when you actually roll your sleeves up, you get involved in going just beyond a transfer of information to actually doing it and learning it on the job. Now, thirdly, you see the immersion in Mark chapter 3, verse 14. That's the verse where it says, Jesus appointed 12, that they might be with him. Notice that those 2 words, those are critical words in this verse. With him. That's doing life together. In other words, he's pulling them into an environment where they're actually doing life together. And everywhere they turn, whether it's to Jesus, to each other, they're seeing this discipleship play itself out. And the same thing happens with us. Now, let's just apply this to leaders here at New Community, or if you're watching from some other community or ministry, you can apply it yourself. But this is how we do it. These e-trainings are a good example of simulated classroom experience, or our events when we transfer information. But we don't stop there. We send you back out to actually do it in your small groups, in your triads, and to put these things into place. We encourage you to have apprentice leaders so that you can have somebody to share the ministry with. You can have someone to have conversations and feedback and talk about it. I get together with you for lunches and breakfast to say, how's it going? What are you learning? So forth. Sometimes I actually come into the small groups and spend time with you in a group. We'll give you feedback afterwards if you're looking for it. And thirdly, immersion is what we're trying to do in the life of the church. We're trying to create a church in which everywhere you turn, you're hearing about discipleship, you're seeing discipleship, you're immersed in it. Just stop and think. Over the last year, we've had a series that's gone on for 16 weeks, spread over these 2 semesters on discipleship. You've been doing it in your groups. We come together and debrief on it in our leadership community. We've got a discipleship conference where we're going to be talking about it with some best practice experts. So we are trying everything we can to create a culture in which these best practices are being modeled for you. And so that's why you should be plugged in to leadership community. You should be plugged in and connected to other leaders where you're talking to them, because this is how we create a culture of disciple making. I'll give you one other example real quickly, simply because we're coming off what we call here an integrated series, where we integrate what we're teaching from the pulpit with our small groups and with our personal devotions. And you've seen the diagram where we use a triangle to take each of those 3 points and to say the reinforcement and the repetition from those 3 different dynamics is what is a best practice. And it was really clear to me as I looked through the surveys that we asked you to fill out that several of you commented on how effective that was and how you'd like to do that all the time. Well, that's because it's a best practice. That's an example of wisdom and how you really create the dynamics in a group that really make it sing. So I hope this will be helpful to you, and I hope you will, over the next month, take some of these ideas and try to implement them and put them into practice in your own small group.